What's up guys, the Strong Boys 19 here. This is going to be another video on my channel's segment, which is the movie reviews segment. With this film review, I am going to talk about a sequel that just came out a few months ago and now released officially, digitally, and on physical format. That many people cited it at the time of its release to this very day as one of the worst films of 2024. I'm going to review the sequel to what was at the time the biggest and highest grossing R-rated film of all time, Joker Folie à Deux. Joker Folie à Deux is the follow-up to Joker, which came out in 2019. It's directed by Todd Phillips, stars Joaquin Phoenix and Robert De Niro, and this was extremely successful. This was highly awarded, and it was known for many as one of the best films of that year. And not only that, Joaquin Phoenix's acting and his overall portrayal as a character named Arthur Fleck, who turned himself to be a Joker, that has been as incredibly praised. This was a film that was like no other Joker-based film that I have ever seen. I was really blown away when this came out. The film made me fall in love with Joaquin Phoenix a lot more. I have seen different films of his previously, like with Walk the Line, to the classic that is Gladiator, and probably my favourite Joaquin Phoenix film is Her, alongside with Joker. And I love the film that much, I have bought the Joker soundtrack. Hilder's music for this film was absolutely phenomenal. I couldn't stop listening to this, and I now cite this soundtrack of Hilder's score as one of my favourite soundtracks of all time. Now, with the sequel, Joker Folie à Deux. I only watched this film once in the cinema, and I still remember my first ever comment. I said, and I quote, "That was not as bad as many people say that it is." But I didn't review the sequel at that time because I didn't want to go on board to be involved along with loads of people in the YouTube universe to review the film. There was a ton of backlash when this film came out, especially with the overall duration of Joaquin Phoenix's character of Arthur Fleck, as well as with the musical aspects, and with this sequel to be a totally different twist and turn. Many people, myself included, was thinking about what would this sequel be. We thought that Joaquin Phoenix's character of Arthur Fleck as his Joker persona would continue this mentality to make a lot of chaos and deconstruction with violence, and to go absolutely ballistic with Harley Quinn as his sidekick. However, Todd Phillips didn't go in that direction. Warner Brothers wanted Todd Phillips to make a sequel since we, as movie fans, made the first Joker film go up to $1 billion. It was the highest grossing R-rated film of all time until Deadpool and Wolverine came out a few months before Folie à Deux came out. That film is now the highest grossing R-rated film ever, which made a whopping $1.3 billion. But the significance and impact that Joker had is still gigantic and highly praised. It was definitely one of those films that loads of people talk about to this very day. With Joker Folie à Deux, I will have a lot to say about this sequel. Folie à Deux was a box office failure when it came out, and I will have to say that is a huge shame. There's a lot to unpack for this review, and I'm also going to talk about the character than to just talk about the film's story itself. there's so much that I have learned from the experience. I've watched Folie 2 4 times. I will talk about the plot as well as with the other things. Before I go straight into the plot, let's go to the background, behind the scenes stuff. And yet, we have to explain that Joker Folie 2 wasn't intended to be made in the first place. Todd Phillips previously said that this Joker film was only made to be a standalone film. But prior to the finishing, making and productivity work of the first Joker film, Joaquin Phoenix had the idea of his Joker to be made as a Broadway musical. His idea came out after a dream he had. The dream was addressed to Todd about his Joker performing, telling jokes and singing songs on stage. When Joker 1 made $1 billion, Joaquin and Todd had the idea to follow up Joker 1 as the formation to make it a Broadway musical, like a proper show. But sadly, it was not meant to be, and it was going to be made at the Carlisle Theatre, but then the COVID-19 pandemic happened, so everything around that idea was scrapped, but Joaquin's idea was still kept inside his head. So in the end, Todd was told by Warner Brothers, who owned the rights to this Joker film, to make a sequel, since the first film, like I said, made $1 billion. Todd's idea for this sequel was to make the continuing direction around Arthur Fleck's identity, not just to think about a sequel to let Arthur become Batman's nemesis. So, through the whole creation of Folie 2, Scott Silver and Todd Phillips began developing the sequel. The musical concept became an involvement later on. Joaquin kept his idea, and Todd thought about putting his idea into this film. Joaquin was originally going to think about having a female Joker to be with Arthur's persona. So, in the end, Todd and Scott came up with the idea of having Harley Quinn instead. The film opens up with the Looney Tunes inspired cartoon called Me and My Shadow. We see two characters, Arthur Fleck and a shadow. Arthur arrives as his Joker persona to a praised, well-attended audience. They were there to see Arthur being their Joker. The shadow causes so much trouble, and when both Arthur and the shadow are in the backstage room, the shadow decides that enough was enough, putting on the clown makeup, abusive with Arthur by stealing his clothes and locking him inside the backstage room. The shadow comes out with the clown makeup and the Joker suit, arriving on stage and singing to the audience. Arthur comes out to the stage, felt embarrassed, being laughed at, and the shadow continues his own shenanigans. While this was going on, the police arrive at the scene. The shadow made Arthur appear with the makeup and suit, returning back to being his shadow. When the guards arrive on the stage, they brutally assault Arthur Fleck. There's a metaphorical message and meaning behind this. It shows that Arthur Fleck is not the Joker in the first place. In my opinion, it was an extremely well-made beginning. I loved the art style, and I thought it was really unique to open up a sequel in that way of thinking. After the Me and My Shadow cartoon introduction, we see the scene of Arthur Fleck coming out from his cell, looking extremely skinny, weaker, vulnerable, and sadly, over time, heavily abused by Brendan Gleeson's character, Jackie Sullivan. Him and the other guards are mean-spirited, abusive bastards who ask Arthur if he has a joke for them, and there was a point when another inmate, Ricky, told from the guards that Arthur is a good kisser. Arthur walks over to him, kisses Ricky, and the guards give Arthur a cigarette. Then we go to some tragic scenes in various moments of Arthur being heavily assaulted. Arthur's in Gotham City's Arkham State Hospital after the crimes he committed 2 years previously of murdering 6 people. We know who Arthur killed: the 3 drunk men in the subway, his not biological mother, Randall Kleimanhofer, and Murray Franklin. Arthur's lawyer is Marianne Stewart. While she checks on him, he goes through the interviews about his crimes, as well as to go through the process from his past experiences Arthur had when he was a child from the abusive trauma. Jackie then decides to take Arthur to a music therapy class with other inmates, as well as we see the introduction of Lady Gaga's character of Harleen Quinzel, or Lee for short. We know by this moment that Lee does have an interest in Arthur, but as we know later on, it turns to be in a different way of her behaviour and personality. Arthur and Lee got talking with each other for the first time about their crimes. Lee then decides in front of Arthur to share her past about her late father, her mother who committed her after she set fire to her parents' apartment. She also says she doesn't feel alone after what Arthur did on live television when he murdered Murray Franklin. Harvey Dent, the district attorney, publicly announced Arthur's death penalty, and Arthur would be involved in the courtroom trials that would be live and broadcasted to everyone in the public. This is the moment where the musical sequences begin. We see scenes of Arthur singing, Lee singing in separate scenes, then to the musical fantasy world of seeing Arthur and Lee singing and dancing with each other together romantically. So it's no surprise that the beginning of their romance starts from there. They were watching a film together with other people, Jackie involved, of The Bandwagon featuring Fred Astaire. And while the movie was screening, Lee then decides to set fire to the place, and as the fire becomes increasingly aggressive, Lee decides to make a run for it with Arthur involved. They tried to make an escape. They were both getting caught. Arthur gets restricted to solitary confinement and stayed there for 2 weeks. Lee, over time in the film, would go into her sneaky ambition for Arthur to return back to his Joker persona, because that is obviously what she wanted Arthur to become. She wanted Arthur to win the court cases so that both of them will be free together. After a televised interview of Arthur Fleck about what he did, later on into the film, the long-awaited trial begins. Lee and some of the crowd attended for support. Marianne claims that Arthur's crimes were committed by Joker's own identity and that his Joker is a separate personality. A psychologist makes comments that Arthur has not got a multiple personality disorder, faking his mental illness, not psychotic, etc. On the 3rd day of the trial, Miss Kane from the first film reads out Arthur's very private diary, as well as his jokes out loud. Arthur wrote about having a dream of Sophie and being obsessed with her on the same day he killed both Randall and Murray Franklin. He wrote about his fantasies and that the jokes, as told by Miss Kane, that were unfunny. There is a scene during the whole process that Marianne decides to reveal the actual truth of who Lee is in front of Arthur. She didn't grow up in the same neighbourhood as him. She lives on the Upper West Side. Her parents are alive and well. She committed herself and checks herself out of the Arkham State Hospital. And she's just playing Arthur for a fool. That made Arthur think about Lee intensely. Going into this questioning mood, asking Lee if she lied to him, Lee then reveals to Arthur she bought his apartment to be their home for their plan to live there when he gets out. while she's singing and dancing in front of Arthur, that interest of Lee didn't go away at all. It continued to escalate. We see Sophie appearing in this film, the former neighbour and imaginary romantic of Arthur's, to share her testimony in court. Besides that she did make a brief experience with Penny Fleck, she reveals the actual truth of what Penny thought of Arthur, which triggered Arthur intensely on the inside, making him uncomfortable. The comments about that he lived in a fantasy world and had a dumb laugh, she made up a story for him when he was a kid to feel better, the story of bringing joy to the world and basing his whole life around it. Arthur quickly decides to make a choice to fire his lawyer, to take a stand and represent himself. This is the moment now that we see Arthur dressed up in his suit with his Joker clown makeup for the last half of the film. The best scene comes up. Arthur talking to Gary Puddles. Gary, like with the other characters, share the testimony. Arthur decides this time around to change his voice into a southern accent. It was really, really weird, I have to admit that, when I first watched this film. But throughout the whole thing, the more I thought about it, it made me think when Arthur used to be his own entertainer to himself, and he was inspired at the time from Joker 1 to create his own persona, and as well as to be inspired by what he saw on TV, like the Murray Franklin show. So I think Arthur's intention was to go into this southern accent to entertain his crowd. So Arthur's southern accent was like a strange idea, but in my opinion, it did work, because the purpose of Arthur's Joker with his audience, he was just there to, I guess, make a show. But throughout the whole thing, this scene was so powerful. Gary's emotional state was shown perfectly, especially with Lee Gill's acting. That was just phenomenal to portray the broken, traumatized, emotional state of himself. The aftermath of Arthur's gruesome killing of Randall Kleimenhofer affected Gary for the rest of his life, and he was scared of him. It's just a brilliant performance and shows the different side of personalities. And what I really liked a lot about that scene was when Gary tried to get Arthur to come out, and when Gary said that he didn't see the Murray Franklin show when Arthur was the guest, you hear the change of voice when Arthur goes from the southern accent to now hearing his actual voice. It's like Gary was trying so hard to get Arthur himself back out while being in this whole experience in front of Arthur as well as everyone in the court. It's just as emotionally charging. The Joker persona took over Arthur Fleck, and Arthur being a Joker affected the friendship of Gary. I don't know about you, but while many people, and obviously myself, see this as the best scene of the film, I think this was also the starting point when Arthur would then begin to think and realize what he had done. You can really feel how broken Gary Puddles was, and Arthur's behaviour while being in his clown makeup and suit just affected his own true self. Arthur's behaviour was full of this boastful, self-entitled, negative attitude. I really do feel sorry for Gary, because he just tried his best to convince to Arthur that what he's doing to him is not the real him. Arthur made a comment at the same time about the guards, calling them fat and stupid. The guards decide then to commit the most brutal amount of violence on Arthur. They take him to the shower, and with our guesses, we think that Arthur gets sexually raped, which made me think as well that it's like what Arthur went through from his past happens again. They took him back to solitary confinement again. Ricky reacted negatively as well as with other inmates. Ricky starts to sing loudly, causing a commotion. Jackie then attacks Ricky, and we hear the sound of him strangling Ricky. Ricky gets killed. You see Arthur's face shook in complete terror. That affected Arthur in his worst state. We see a flashback of him in the iconic bathroom sequence from the first Joker film, washing his face. So, by this scene, we need to think about what happened there. Arthur was realizing what he did do. After all of this time, ever since he became so mentally insane and completely lost it, committed violence from the first Joker film, it led to this point now that what he has done not only affected his own life, but it affected those around him. So Arthur had to make a choice. He decides then to do something that affected everybody in Gotham City negatively, as well as us as the movie audience. He decides to give himself up being a Joker because of preventing others and friends like Ricky from getting affected with violence and to be killed. That is the truth as to why Arthur decided to go in this way. In the aftermath of that horrific scene, on the last day of the trial, Arthur feels emotionally defeated in front of the supporters and Lee and the judge, expresses his frustrations about what the people want of seeing him as a Joker, and says it was all a fantasy to say there is no Joker. He confessed everything in front of everyone that it was him who did the murders. After what Arthur said, Lee and some of the supporters walked out from the courtroom being so hurt. It was just his choice of escape to not become who they want him to be anymore. And while that was the right thing to do, sadly, it didn't last very long for Arthur Fleck. On the day of the verdict, Arthur was found guilty, then begins laughing hysterically, and while this madness was going on, when someone grabs Arthur and attacking him, a huge car bomb explosion came out. The whole courtroom was destroyed. Lots of the people were perished. Arthur slowly walks out, and then he was forced into a car by two Joker supporters, but Arthur makes a run for it. He wanted to get away from society's chaos and mentality of their destruction. Arthur walks back to go back to his own apartment. He spots Lee. Lee doesn't have affection and interest for Arthur anymore. All she had all of this time was only for Arthur to come back as the Joker that she loved. That's all she wanted in front of Arthur. And one of the things she said to Arthur, all they had was this fantasy world. She was just not having any care for Arthur. And it's even sadder that all of this chaos that was done by Arthur, in the end, Arthur has nobody else but himself. Lee starts singing in her fantasy world, which also means that the fantasy world will never be ending for herself, because that's what she is trapped inside with. Arthur Fleck is not in that same way anymore. The police arrive at the scene after Lee walks off. The police take Arthur back to Arkham State Hospital. Arthur gets a call to say that he has a visitor. While walking, the inmate, who was actually shown earlier in the film, who was obviously fascinated and stared at Arthur intensely because of his obsession with Arthur Fleck's persona, tells Arthur a joke. A joke that makes the reference of a psychopath and a famous clown. Now, this joke that was addressed to Arthur is, in secret, the feeling that the inmate was really let down and upset by what Arthur did. The famous clown was Arthur Fleck, and the psychopath was the inmate. He ends the joke by saying the exact same line like Arthur did when he murdered Murray Franklin of "How about I get you what you fucking deserve?" The inmate stabs Arthur multiple times. Arthur was bleeding intensely and slowly passes away. And when the camera slowly moves closer to Arthur's lifeless body, the inmate carves a smile of his face, and then the film ends. The time has come for me to say what I think about this film. When I first watched Joker Folie Deux, I couldn't stop thinking about this film for an entire week, just like with the first Joker film when that came out. And in preparation for this review, I was thinking about the film for more than 2 weeks, with repeated questions, repeated answers, and with a lot of this feedback from people either positively or negatively, and with me who decided to watch both of these two films front to back. I will now say what I think of it. Joker Folie Deux is one of my favourite sequels. This film was purposefully made in its intentions to focus on Arthur Fleck. The entire time of the story around Arthur Fleck, from being a failed comedian and a mentally unstable and insanity-made personality, of creating a persona of his own, to the continuation of his experiences of being a prisoner, trying to find any hope of love and acceptance from anybody like Lee. Joker Folie Deux finishes the life of Arthur Fleck in a tragic tale. And I personally think it is absolutely phenomenal. Joker, to me, is in some way the stronger, better film. But when it comes to me accepting, to realise and to change my original reactions of Folie Deux, the entirety of Arthur Fleck's story in this film did make sense, just like what we know and love from the first film. Lots of praises will have to be addressed. Obviously, with the acting from Joaquin Phoenix, Lady Gaga, Lee Gill, Brendan Gleeson, Steve Coogan, everybody else. The acting was brilliant. Absolutely awesome. One of the best things about Folie Deux was the cinematography, done once again by Lawrence Sher. His work was breathtaking. I adored his work as the cinematographer for Joker 1, and he did a lot of work professionally and perfectly in Joker Folie Deux. The colours, the lighting, the effects. There's been a shit ton of productivity that was made to 100% perfection for this film. Hilder's score was really, really great. Although I still prefer the score from the first one, but in Folie Deux, I loved her ambition to return back to the instrumentation from what was recorded and made from the first film score, and in this one, it's like even more intense and full of suspense. For some people who loved this film, they would maybe pick this film above Joker 1. Whereas with me, if I have to make my comment around that, I can't pick which one I love than the other. I just think both of these two films worked together 100%. Todd Phillips, I think, once again did another outstanding job by continuing his own artistic vision, the vision that was captured in Joker 1, and he continued to nail it in Joker Folie Deux. Besides the acting and everything else, I really enjoyed a lot of the music in these whole moments of the fantasy musical sequences, to the scenes of Arthur singing separately and Lee singing separately. The recorded versions of songs were placed in the correct order, and not only these are just covers, these are versions to connect to the feeling and the sound of the story, and the lyrics are perfectly addressing what the relationship between Arthur and Lee had become while the film moves forward. Their moments arrive when these characters have the music in their heads, and the film captures them nicely, and they don't feel rushed. It's both their escapism from their harsh realities, and the music is what brings them the most positive journey. I originally thought that Joaquin Phoenix's sound of vocals were like auto-tunes, like pitch corrected. But the more I thought about it, Joaquin Phoenix did say that Arthur was not a trained vocalist. And while I thought about that, and for what it tried to represent, for what it stands for, I think it does make sense for me to accept it. Arthur's not a singer. He was more like an entertainer. And with Lee, played by Lady Gaga, I think her acting as Lee was very, very good. I think she was just a character that was a part of society, just like with Arthur Fleck. And Lady Gaga's own way to change her usual sound and style of vocals, it was very effective. Lady Gaga's performance is also one of the best things about it. I do not agree that some people would write this film off for having Lady Gaga as just for show, and that her performances and appearances were just, limited. But this was the story that focuses obviously on Arthur Fleck, but when Arthur Fleck tried to have anybody else to understand him, Lee was there obviously for negative reactions that we know who Lee is. Lee was obviously using Arthur, but Arthur at the time thought that he finally found somebody to have any companionship and connection with than to just being alone. The title of the film, Folie Deux, originally made me think too that it's shared madness between Arthur and Lee. That doesn't make sense now, because Folie Deux is shared madness between Arthur Fleck and his Joker persona. That was the point. Lee's character, like I said, was a part of the society. The same society that affected Arthur to become who he became in the end. The ending was the most controversial moment in the entire film. I didn't expect it at all. None of us did. I was really shocked when Arthur was killed off in that way. But I thought about the ending a lot. It made me think about the character when I watched the film over and over. And then I noticed this inmate was actually visible in multiple different scenes earlier in the film. He was there in the background staring at Arthur. He was there being the only inmate dancing with Arthur behind him when Arthur started singing and dancing for the first time. And when Arthur was televised, he was watching. You see the change of expression on his face. Then you see him for the final time when he tells Arthur that psychopathic versus famous clown joke. There was that understanding. The inmate was not happy when Arthur gave it all up. That's why he killed him. And we know to see that the Joker persona is now surpassed to this inmate. I looked at the video of just the ending of the film. Somebody in the comments made a great, amazing take that I did not realize. This interpretation of a take of the inmate being Arthur's shadow. Why didn't I think of that? When I looked back at the Me and My Shadow cartoon, look at the facial expressions from the shadow and look at the face from the inmate. I thought that was just amazing. I was shocked that I did not think about it in that way before. There's one thing I want to point out right now. Stop thinking about Heath Ledger's Joker. These two Joker films were set in the 1980s. The Dark Knight came out in 2008. Just because the inmate carved a smile on his face does not mean that he's related to Heath Ledger's Joker. Heath Ledger's Joker is totally different to Arthur's Joker. Obviously, we adored and still admire the late great Heath Ledger's Joker. His character was out of control, brutal, chaotic, whereas Arthur Fleck's Joker is completely the polar opposite. The story of Arthur Fleck, too, is not a connection to the universe of Batman. Arthur Fleck was a character that was not just a character that was not based in the comics. Arthur was just a part of society. Which brings me now to this next point, that while people have a lot of sympathy and admiration for Arthur Fleck, that does not mean that you should really think that what Arthur did was good. Arthur was just as a bad person himself, not just society as a whole. Arthur Fleck was a character with a different story, and I personally have loved a lot of it. Todd Phillips did say previously that it was made just as an origin story. It was not made purposefully as the definitive origin story. So that is completely easy to understand, and yet loads of other people would continue to target Todd Phillips in their very ungrateful matters and mood to think that this sequel was purposefully made just to shit on the fans and to, increase the backlash even more with no further proof and excuses. But for those who have seen Folie, Deux, given it a fair chance, being completely open-minded, if they still don't like it, that is totally fine. But when it comes to the outlandish, negative-driven and forced out, really bashful people who trashed this film with a lot of the same comments about it. They haven't really looked into the film in a focused, deeper mindset. And besides that, these assholes have decided to leak the plot while the film was still screening in the cinemas. That is even more disgusting and disrespectful to the people who have worked a lot for this sequel. It's just a huge shame. Arthur Fleck's life in Joker 1 had been extremely hard, and it's like that he wanted to try as best as he could to have a sense of purpose. And I find it as sad when you think about the state of who he has become in the end, and then to think about what society has done to him. Arthur was a person that was not intentionally violent for the sake of this film. Todd Phillips did create his own story that was unique and as interesting and perfectly detailed, just like with Joker Folie Deux. Obviously, we know what happens throughout the whole concept of this film, with Joker focusing around Arthur Fleck being a failed stand-up comedian, and he did have a job as a clown, an entertainer for anybody. Then we see the decline of anything positive in Arthur Fleck's mental health state. We see the later moments of characters that would turn their back away from Arthur that Arthur didn't realize. We know what happened with the asshole that was Randall Kleimenhofer, who framed Arthur about the gun that he gave to Arthur. After the beginning of the film, Arthur got attacked by kids. We find out about Penny Fleck, who was not Arthur's actual biological mother. Arthur was adopted, and he was brutalized with violence not only by Penny Fleck, but with her abusive boyfriends. And besides that, Penny did have an interest and a bit of a romance with Thomas Wayne. Arthur Fleck didn't think straight and not hard enough to know that Thomas Wayne was not Arthur's dad. So the more scarring moments Arthur Fleck's life had become, it's like nothing would ever stop him to always just be himself. We know what happened when Murray Franklin publicly bullied Arthur's own brief TV performance of a stand-up comedian, and that was an intention of Arthur for not only to be inspired by the Murray Franklin show, he had an intention to be a guest on the Murray Franklin show, to dress up smartly, and then to kill himself on stage. But when he becomes a Joker of his own, we know what happens. He would use Murray Franklin as one of the biggest targets. When they saw his Joker persona murder Murray Franklin on live TV, they saw him as a Joker, not on Arthur Fleck. And in Joker Folie Deux, this was the realization in the later half of the film. Arthur knew that what he did do was very, very bad, and that violence was not the right way. Society were idolizing his persona, and they have no interest in Arthur Fleck. Just like with Lee Quinzel herself. Just like with The Inmate. So, these two stories that, in the end, connect everything into place, a really profound and as an addictive experience. Addictive to love these films. With Joker 1 and 2 together, it made me realize what an outstanding concept this really had become around Arthur Fleck. I think this is a sequel that does have a growing cult following. Despite that, it has been known as one of the worst films of last year, and with Tim Dillon, who played one of the guards, called it the worst film ever made, which I highly disagree. Quentin Tarantino made his comments, and he's a big fan of this film as well, which I did not expect. But I totally understand what he was saying. Just like with what Todd Phillips, the director, had to explain why this film was made this way. It can be either a great film or a good film to you. If you still don't like the film, but to respect it with that whole idea around Arthur Fleck, that's totally fine. That's personally all I would like to say about Joker Folie Deux. With my original reactions that were not very negative, I thought it was just an above average film. But the more I looked into this, I think this is one of those sequels that I've grown to love. Let me know what you guys think of Joker Folie Deux in the comments down below. If you have your own theories about it, if you have your own comments about it, what do you think of the whole premise of this story? Let me know. Even if it's just at a negative reaction, but at least I hope you guys have enjoyed and appreciated what I think of this sequel. It may not be a sequel for you, but I think also this was a film that was made for Joaquin Phoenix because of the whole musical side of this. And I really did appreciate and grew to like and love a lot of what Todd Phillips and company did create here. For Joker 1, this was near perfection, but this would be, at this stage, can't believe I said that because I'm thinking about the musical bits with some of the stage scenes, I would give Joker 1 immediately just a 5 out of 5 rating, because I've watched this last night and it still is as a phenomenal and amazing experience. For Joker Folie Deux, it obviously has to be at a high rating, because while there's minor flaws like with the awkward, unnecessary sex scene, to some of the moments like with some court scenes that drag a bit slow, but I was invested in them at the same time. This is a rating of a 4.5 out of 5. These two films, for me, have been some of my favourite brief franchises that I've seen. Thank you guys for watching, and as always, I will keep you guys posted for more videos in the near future. That's life.